Tonight, we're going to do something that upsets everybody. We're going to look at how Ukraine ended up as the most dangerous square in the world's chessboard. Not from Moscow's point of view, not from Washington's, but from the boring, awkward place called evidence. No flags here, no team scarves, just a paper trail. And here's what you're actually going to see tonight. A leaked phone call that proves American officials were literally naming Ukraine's next government before the government fell. You're going to find out why the official sniper story from the Maidan just doesn't add up, and why there's never been a proper investigation. You'll learn what the oligarchs were actually doing while Ukraine tore itself apart. And you'll understand why Russia keeps saying unprovoked is doing a lot of heavy lifting in political speeches. If you've been told this is a simple story of unprovoked invasion on one side or NATO Nazi puppets on the other, you've been lied to. Simple as that. Both sides are pumping out industrial scale propaganda, and ordinary Ukrainians are the ones paying the bill in blood. So let's wind this back and ask, how the hell did we actually get here? But before we go into that, let's set the ground rules. This is how this channel works. First, nothing in this episode excuses war crimes from any side. Explaining a chain of events is not the same as justifying it. We're not here to make anyone feel better about what's happening. We're here to understand it. You deal with your own emotions. Second, we'll look at official documents, authenticated leaked calls, voting records, NGO funding data, and casualty statistics. Where there's hard evidence, we'll say so. Where it's contested or shady, we'll say that too. And third, yeah, we will talk about Nazis, oligarchs, the CIA, the EU, NATO, Soros, the whole shebang. But the bar is, can you actually prove it? Not some guy on Telegram said so. Not, it sounds plausible. Think of this as a long interview that you're going to be given in a police station by Jack Regan. You better get your trousers on, because you've pulled.
Can you walk?
Yeah.
Get your trousers on.
Let's start with Ukraine, a borderland with a split history. And this is something nobody on Twitter obviously wants to hear. Ukraine has never been a neat, unified nation state with a single shared story. It's been a borderland. Apparently, literally, that's what Ukraine means. Squeezed between empires for centuries. The Polish-Lithuanian Empire, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, then Soviet. And that's not ancient history, that's the living memory of people still alive today. Here's how the splits ran. The west of today's Ukraine spent centuries under Polish and Austro-Hungarian rule. Catholic, Uniate, looking to Europe. The east and the south, Russian Empire, then USSR. Russian-speaking, Orthodox, economically tied to Moscow. And why does this matter? Because when the pressure hits, invasion, revolution, economic collapse, those old lines don't vanish. They light up like neon signs. Let's go back to World War II and the Bandera problem. 1941, Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. Parts of western Ukraine, freshly seized by Stalin just years earlier, greet the Germans as liberators. Out of that environment you get Stepan Bandera and the OUN, hardline nationalists who collaborate with the Nazis. They form SS units and they participate in massacres of Jews and Poles. And depending on which propaganda you listen to, Bandera is either a heroic freedom fighter or the devil himself. The awkward truth sits in the middle. There was a large-scale collaboration, there was ethnic cleansing, and it left a bitter legacy that still poisons politics today. And here's the kicker. After the war, elements of these nationalist networks aren't wiped out. They're kept because they're useful. The Cold War, nationalists on the CIA payroll. Declassified material shows us that the US intelligence services cultivated Ukrainian nationalist groups from the late 1940s as anti-Soviet assets. And I'm not being diplomatic here. People with blood on their hands from wartime atrocities were quietly protected, moved to the West, and repurposed for information and covert operations during the Cold War. Figures linked to ethnic cleansing ended up living comfortably in the US without ever facing trial because these anti-Moscow credentials were more valuable than justice. Does that mean the CIA created Ukrainian nationalism? No. But it does mean certain strains of it survived, were organised, and could be tapped later when it was convenient. So by the time the Soviet Union starts wobbling in the late 80s, you don't just have a population with divided historical memories. You have pre-existing networks, contacts, and exiled organisations ready to jump back in when the moment comes. And then we have independence. When the USSR collapses in 1991, Ukraine isn't a basket case on paper. It's an industrial heavyweight, shipyards, aerospace, heavy engineering, massive agricultural. Roughly a fifth of Soviet industrial output was on Ukrainian territory. And what happens next is the classic post-Soviet car crash. Botched privatizations, corrupt officials, and well-connected businessmen carve up state assets at fire sale prices. You go from publicly owned heavy industry to a handful of blokes in suits who suddenly own half the country. Those are the oligarchs. And who are we talking about? Let's name some names. Rinat Akhmetov, mining, steel, owns a football club in Donetsk. Viktor Pinchuk, steel, married into the system. Dmitry Firtash, chemicals, gas, deals with Russia, later fought extradition to the US. These aren't abstract villains, they own TV channels, 1+1, Inter, ICTV. They sponsor politicians. They sit at tables where Ukraine's foreign policy gets decided. And what they captured? TV channels and media, political parties and election campaigns, courts and regulators. And they play a double game, cutting deals with both Moscow and Western capitals as long as the money keeps flowing. The ordinary Ukrainians? Their economy implodes, GDP shrinks massively, real wages collapse, and Ukraine slides from one of the most advanced Soviet republics to poorest country in Europe by some measure. If you want fertile ground for revolution, you couldn't design it better. In the 2000s, a new phase enters the geopolitical lexicon, colour revolutions. These are peaceful-looking uprisings built around NGOs, student groups, and slick media operations aimed at flipping regimes without rolling tanks across borders. On paper, Western foundations and government-linked bodies are there to promote democracy, civil society, and reform. In practice, they're also choosing favourites and funding infrastructure that just happens to come in very handy when a government falls out of favour. Two players matter here. The National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, explicitly set up in the 1980s to do in the open what intelligence agencies couldn't comfortably do in secret anymore. Between 2000 and 2013, NED spent millions of dollars on Ukrainian NGOs, media projects, and civic initiatives. Specific programs: the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, Ukraine's Opora, election monitoring, media training for independent journalists. These aren't fringe operations, they're infrastructure. And the second one, the second player, George Soros's Open Society Network. Active in Ukraine since before formal independence, funding thousands of projects, education, legal reform, civil society organisations, and later embedding advisors inside post-Maidan reform bodies. Now, none of this proves a grand unified conspiracy, but what does it mean? By the time people start heading to the streets, there's already a Western-funded ecosystem of activists, media, trainers, lawyers, and spin doctors in play. When pressure builds, that infrastructure is ready to mobilise. 2004, the rehearsal. The 2004 Orange Revolution. Two victors run for president. Yanukovych, closer to Moscow, and Yushchenko, favoured by the West, whose wife, incidentally, is a former US State Department official. During the campaign, Yushchenko mysteriously gets poisoned and ends up with a badly disfigured face, which generates massive sympathy. The case is still murky. We don't know for certain who did it or why. When the initial result says Yanukovych has won though, you get mass protests, Western diplomats flying in, and huge Western media coverage. Under pressure, the result is annulled. A rerun is held, and Yushchenko wins. And we're seeing echoes of similar operations in South America right now. What's significant? Yushchenko's later move to award Stepan Bandera, the World War II collaborator, the title of Hero of Ukraine. That tells you a lot about which historical narrative his camp wanted to rehabilitate. It also deepens the East-West cultural fracture. That's 2004. 10 years later, the same basic lines line up again, but this time with much higher stakes.
The wrong one.
And here's the question that'll keep you watching. Did the same playbook that flipped Ukraine in 2004 just get reused in 2014? And if so, who was running it? Stick around. Maidan. Let's fast forward to late 2013. Ukraine is supposed to sign an association agreement with the EU, a trade and political deal that pulls it further west. Moscow hates this and dangles a big financial package to keep Kiev in its orbit. President Yanukovych, under pressure from Russia and worried about the economic pain attached to EU membership criteria, pauses the agreement. Students and activists hit Kiev's Maidan Square. Within days, new opposition-friendly TV channels amplify the message, and the protest brand Euromaidan goes global. So far, this is a familiar story, protests against a corrupt, wobbly government. Then the mask slips. Nuland and Pia enter stage left. In February 2014, in the middle of the Maidan protests, a recording leak online.
What do you think?
I think we're in play.
Two American officials, Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State, and Jeffrey Pia, US Ambassador in Kiev, are caught on tape calmly assembling the next Ukrainian government like they're planning a cabinet reshuffle in Washington.
Your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
We want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Cleach and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
They're not discussing options, they're just naming them. Nuland says, I think Yats is the guy. Arsenally Yatsenovich for Prime Minister. Washington never denied it. They just complained it was a leaked call. Probably the Russians, they said. When Yanukovych falls 2 weeks later, Yats becomes the Prime Minister, exactly as discussed on the tape. It happened, and the White House confirmed it was their officials' voices. So when Ukrainians ask who's really running this, and when Russians point at it as proof of Western puppet mastery, you got to understand why they're asking.
Yeah, I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
The protests escalate. There's a grim turning point between 18 and 21st of February 2014. Snipers fire on Maidan. The official story: Yanukovych's security forces. The death toll: 102 people. Shocking, brutal, a turning point that galvanised the opposition and shocked the world. And this is where it gets complicated. A leaked phone call between Estonia's foreign minister and Catherine Ashton, then the EU's top diplomat, passes on testimony from a forensic doctor treating the wounded. What did he tell them? Same bullets, same wound patterns in both police and protesters. A 2023 academic paper analysed the ballistics evidence and concluded it fits the profile of a false flag operation. A third party firing on both sides to tip the balance. Does that prove it was staged? No, but it proves the official story isn't the only one consistent with the forensic evidence. And here's the kicker: after an event that triggered a government collapse and eventually a war, there's never been a fully transparent, internationally trusted investigation into who actually ordered the shootings. For something that consequential, that's, well, convenient. Another piece everybody argues about: the far right. And groups like Right Sector and what later becomes the Azov Battalion are not massive in voter terms, but they punch well above their weight on the street. They provide hardened fighters, organise barricades, and eventually form volunteer battalions deployed to the front in Donbass. And some of these groups use open neo-Nazi symbols and have leaders on record saying things about white crusades. And that would get you banned from polite company instantly. Russian propaganda inflates this into Ukraine as a Nazi state. Western media downplays it as marginal extremists. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle. The far right is a real strand in Ukraine's political military ecosystem, and it's been partially integrated into state structures. But it does not represent the entire country. 2014, the language, Crimea, Donbass, and the war that already started. Yanukovych flees, a new Western-leaning government takes over in Kiev. One of the first moves, Parliament votes to repeal a law that had given Russia a degree of regional status in areas where Russian speakers are a big chunk of the population. The acting president later vetoes it, but the symbolism is catastrophic in the east and in the south. This looks like they're coming for our language and our identity. Within weeks, the dominoes fall. Crimea, Russia moves in. It already has the Black Sea Fleet there, and the population is majority Russian. A referendum is held under military occupation. Moscow annexes the peninsula. Donbass. Pro-Russian and anti-Maidan protests in Donetsk and Luhansk morph into armed uprisings, supported, armed, and increasingly led by people and kit coming across the Russian border. Kiev brands this anti-terrorist operations and sends in the army and volunteer battalions. By the time most Western audiences even hear the word Donbass, thousands are already dead, and the front lines have barely moved. The war in eastern Ukraine doesn't start in 2022, it starts in 2014. 8 years of low-level conflict, artillery, trenches, attrition, all before the full-scale invasion. Minsk, NATO and Russia's security paranoia. Attempts are made to stop the bleeding. The Minsk Accords. On paper they promise a ceasefire, local autonomy for Donbass within Ukraine, and a path back to control of the borders. In reality, almost nobody fully implements what they signed, and both sides use the lull to rearm and dig in deeper. At the same time, another track is running. That track being NATO. Back in 2008, NATO's Bucharest summit declares that Ukraine and Georgia will become members at some undefined future point. Senior US diplomats, Cold War veterans and scholars have been warning for years that pushing NATO right up to Russia's borders, especially in Ukraine, would trigger exactly the kind of reaction we're now living through. From Moscow's point of view, right or wrong, Ukraine sliding towards the EU, NATO training programs and anti-Russian language laws all look like a hostile armed bloc taking over what they see as their strategic backyard. For a nuclear-armed security establishment still traumatised by the chaos of the 1990s, that's a red line. Again, this doesn't justify invasion, but it does explain why Unprovoked is doing a lot of heavy lifting in political speeches. 2022, the invasion and the narratives. By February 2022, the ingredients are all in the pot. 8 years of low-level war in Donbass, dead Minsk agreements, a Ukrainian state more integrated with Western militaries and intelligence, a Russian leadership convinced NATO is creeping closer and that Kiev might try to retake the separatist regions by force. Moscow invades. Kiev and the West present this as a clear-cut war of aggression. Moscow presents it as a preemptive self-defense and denazification, pointing to Azov and others as proof. And here's the thing, let's actually test that denazification claim instead of just dismissing it. Moscow says Ukraine is a Nazi state run by fascists. They point to Azov, right sector, and the stuff Bandera's admirers say. Right, here's the forensics. Azov's got maybe 2,000 to 3,000 fighters at peak strength. Ukraine's mobilised millions of troops in this war. The far right has held ministerial positions, never more than a handful, but always marginal to the actual power structure. In the 2019 elections, all far-right parties combined pooled less than 3% of the vote. Compare that to Hungary, where the government is explicitly nationalist, conservative, and keeps winning landslides. Or Germany, where the AfD is surging into double figures. Is Ukraine free of neo-Nazis? No. Is the whole country fascist? Not even close. Is Azov being integrated into state structures a problem worth watching? Absolutely. But Nazis run Ukraine doesn't pass the sniff test. It's a pretext dressed up as analysis. And where does that leave us? So where are we now? Ukraine is a country with a tragic history of being a buffer zone between bigger powers. It's a state looted by its own elites, pulled apart by competing national stories and languages. It's a battlefield where Western governments in Russia have treated 40-odd million people as pieces in a game, funding their favoured factions, media and militias. And right now, a place where people with absolutely no say in any of these grand strategies are being shelled, conscripted, displaced and killed. If you want this to be a Marvel movie, brave democracy versus evil autocracy, or holy Russia versus Nazi puppets, you'll hate this episode because real life is much, much uglier. Everyone's fingerprints are on this crime scene. In future parts we can zoom in on specific questions, the Azov battalion in detail, what's actually in those IMF and EU loan conditions, what was in the reports by the EU, by the US and by the United Nations on Ukraine's corruption and rights issues, how much foreign money went where and who got rich. And for now, the takeaway is simple. If someone is selling you a clean, heroic one-page story about Ukraine, they're not informing you, they're recruiting you. On this channel, you don't get recruited, you get the case file. Like if you've been lied to about Ukraine. Subscribe if you want the other side of stories everyone's selling you as simple. Comment below. What bit of this surprised you? What did you think was different from what you'd heard before? Where do you want to go next?